Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. Must religion and science conflict? In our final conversation with Ben Spackman, we'll address that issue and we'll talk about two events from the Bible that require a lot of faith to believe: Noah's flood and the resurrection of Jesus. What can we learn from those stories, and what can science teach us? Ben Spackman will answer that question. Check out our conversation. I'd also like to encourage you to please check out our newsletter. You can get some inside scoops and find out who the upcoming interviews are. Our next one, by the way, is going to be with Matt Harris. We interviewed him previously, but we're going to be talking about President Benson, so it's going to be a lot of fun. So please sign up for our newsletter. Go to gospeltangents.com/newsletter. Now back to our conversation.
Now I say all of this again in context of Genesis and evolution and things. There may be other aspects to Scripture and history and science where I would respond differently. Well, let's compare and contrast the resurrection and the flood. People sometimes say, well, atheists in particular, science proves that Jesus couldn't be resurrected. And I think, well, science hasn't resurrected anyone yet, but I'm not sure it has proven the negative. On the other hand, what proof, if Jesus is resurrected, what kind of evidence would we expect in the historical record? Very little. Mostly historical or literary, which is what we find. On the other hand, when it comes to the flood, what kind of evidence would a global flood that covered all the mountains to, 30 cubits deep. So we're talking 30 cubits over the top of the Himalayas for at least 40 days. What kind of evidence should that leave in the historical record? Absolute masses of evidence everywhere should be in the historical record across dozens of disciplines, and it's simply not there. And that, again, is one area where I say, well, what does contextual reading actually get us with the flood? What is the flood actually trying to teach? Is it a historical event, and that's the important thing, or is it doing something different? And like Genesis, I think it's doing something quite different, but that's another book. So what can science tell us about Scripture? Some things, not everything, and it depends on the question. Mm-hmm. I don't like... Generalizing is dangerous. And being simplistic is dangerous because things are rarely simplistic, which is a generalization. But, yeah. So after those two articles in the New Era, I hope to see some further things, maybe in the Enzyme, aimed at adults, maybe a gospel topics essay, at least letting the broader world know that we teach evolution at BYU. They actually believe evolution. The biologists who teach it at BYU, it's been taught for 50 years. The church is neutral on evolution. There are these different ranges of positions. How do we make sense of that with Scripture? That's an important question that has not really been solved yet.
It sounds like your answer is just separate them completely. Scripture is Scripture,
well,
evolution is evolution.
Yes and no. There was a famous Harvard scientist whose name is kind of escaping, Stephen Gould, who tried to solve the so-called science-religion conflict by creating non-overlapping magisteria, or noma. He says, science tells us one thing, religion tells us another thing, and they don't overlap, so it's not a problem. The problem is that neat separation often doesn't work. It just happens to be the case in Genesis 1 through 3, where I think a contextual reading against this background Babylonian stuff in Hebrew and so on says, these guys aren't talking about science. That's why it doesn't have anything to do with science. I don't think Noma works very well. That religion is about morality and about the future, whereas science is about the past and about the natural world. Well, science often tries to say things about morality. I think it fails. And religion often has things to say about how the world is. Yeah, that's all I really want to say about Stephen Gould and Noma. One of the other interesting things that I tend to bring up with people that gets into Gould a little bit, but in the late 1800s, with the rise of science as a profession and professionalization and things like that, there was also an increased public awareness of science and professionalizing, and kind of lay people versus experts, which plays into the anti-clerical thing. So these guys put forth an idea that became extremely popular, and it's kind of the default assumption that people have today, whether they're religious or not, that science and religion are kind of inevitably and always have been in conflict with each other. It's flatly rejected by historians across the board, but it won in popular culture. They had bad historical arguments. They had really anachronistic definitions of what religion and science are. They were motivated by political and other things. There's a book that just came out on it, and the subtitle expresses the frustration of the actual historians. It's called "The Warfare Between Science and Religion: The Idea That Wouldn't Die." When you look back in history of science at the really big names that you would recognize, Galileo, Newton, Copernicus, Robert Boyle, who's the father of chemistry. The way we teach science and the way people conceptualize religion and science is really kind of off, because all of these people that we think of as the great scientists that you might learn about in high school, all of this stuff that they were doing, they thought they were doing religion. They were into this two books mindset where if you wanted to study God directly, you did theology, which was a really difficult degree because it required mastering philosophy and mathematics and all these things. But if you wanted to study God indirectly, you did natural philosophy. The way these people get presented is you're told, here's Newton. Newton comes up with calculus and the laws of motion and all this stuff. What you're not told is that Newton was doing this as a way to study God. What you're not told is that Newton, who was somewhat unorthodox, was still deeply religious, and of the roughly 5 million words of his that we have preserved, 60-70% of that is interpreting the Bible, writing about the tabernacle, trying to figure out the Old Testament timeline. These people who we think were doing science, not religion, they thought they were doing religion. And so we have to be careful as we look back in time at these people, at religion and science in the past. Think about Galileo's story as theology crushing science. It doesn't matter who you read, they'll tell you it's a lot more complicated than that. Galileo, for example, was not a very subtle guy. He was friends with the Pope, and he put the Pope's argument in the mouth of one of his characters named Idiot. That's not going to go over very well. And so these are not simplistic things. We have to think about these things in context. We have to think about them with some depth. We have to be careful about how we impose our modern assumptions, our modern views, our modern definitions on the past, whether that's Galileo, whether that's Newton, whether that's Genesis. We can't just jump in without thinking about any of that stuff. And my impression is that what we're seeing in the church today is professionalization. That is, if I was talking about professionalization of science, and now Sidney Sperry was the first kind of professional Old Testament guy in the church, it took a while for us to have professional historians. But now we're seeing the fruits of that with the Joseph Smith papers, with the Joseph Smith Papers Project, with the Gospel Topics essays. These people who are professionally trained are being trusted by the authorities of the church in terms of the information they're presenting. We're not there yet with our Bible scholars. Even our very orthodox, vetted, gatekeepered Bible scholars at BYU who write about this stuff, Our manuals dealing with ancient scripture are not nearly on the same level as our manuals dealing with D&C, dealing with issues in church history. But I expect that that's coming, because we now have those people trained. We now have those people writing. It just has to make it through. To take an example on the opposite side, if you go look at the 1980 Old Testament Institute Manual, which remains the current manual, which is translated and it's all over the world. Let's say you're a new convert in Malaysia, and you're coming from a Buddhist background, or South Africa, and you're coming from kind of a fundamentalist Protestant background, or Russia, Greek Orthodox, and you want to know, what does the church say about Genesis 1? The most detailed official place you're going to find is the Institute Manual from 1980. And if you go and you look, what you find is a long quote from Joseph Fielding Smith about how people have to choose between evolution and the gospel, and a almost 2,000-word citation from a Seventh-day Adventist at a creationist institute about supposed scientific evidence in favor of evolution. People are going to come away from that thinking the church is very negative on evolution, the church is very negative on science, they're very creationist. Take that however you want. I mean, technically we're all creationists in the sense that I believe God created things, right? But I'm also very much on the evolution, old earth, whatever science tells us is what it tells us. There's a passage in D&C that says God hasn't really revealed how creation happened, but it'll be revealed later. I don't remember the reference, but that's what people will find. And so even in England, there have been issues with people over the age of 40 and 50 assuming that the church's official position is young earth creationism, and further that there's science to back that. And when they find out that's not the case, the whole house of cards that they've constructed on that assumption collapses. So, yeah. I don't like sounding too negative. I try not to write things unless they're constructive. And when I'm speaking, it becomes a little bit more spontaneous. I'm a little bit of a cynic, but I try to channel that and make it constructive. I'm deeply a believer, but I'm also a cynic. So these kind of mesh uncomfortably at times. Yeah.
Well, great. Well, are there any last things you want to mention before I let you go?
I do expect to see some shifts in the future around this. Perhaps 100 or 200 years from now, this will be kind of like the, where I say to people, now obviously you all know the church's position on evolution is that evolution happened. But did you know that this is also contrary to Scripture in some sense and wasn't the church's teaching for a while, just like with the sun going, or the earth going around the sun? People may one day come to take that for granted as the church's position. And then, of course, we'll have other problems. There are always problems. Things are always changing. Culture shifts, knowledge shifts, science and technology march on. But I guess the one takeaway would be that I hope people will think about their assumptions and try to read some of the books I've referenced, or come find some of my posts or other podcasts.
When is your book coming out, by the way?
I have learned to stop giving a date. Currently it's under contract with the Maxwell Institute. Mm-hmm. I'm told that once I get them the manuscript, they need at least 6 months. And they're not getting the manuscript anytime soon because I'm preparing for my PhD exams and my dissertation. And so I don't know. Okay. I hope before we get to Old Testament again in 4 years. But that might be me going out on a limb and being hopeful. But I should say...
Well, it's only 3 years away now.
That's true.
New Testament, right?
I should say that the public papers that I do, the podcasts I do, the things I write on my blog, all of those are outgrowth in some way from my book. So the Joseph Smith papers thing I did recently was about, given differences between Genesis, Moses, and Abraham, how should we think about our conception of revelation? And I argued that we can't think of revelation as just God handing over facts, because If you do, that creates serious problems for these books. I'm probably doing that again. A couple years ago, I was at the Fair Conference talking about assumptions we need to think about before we interpret Genesis, and I talked about accommodation, for example. I've done, let's see, what else have I done? My paper at UVU was all about kind of the history of concordism and why very deeply believing scholars are now rejecting concordism, and where our history, our interpretive history as Mormons, fits into this broader history, and why Mormons are not familiar with the Babylonian material or the ideas around concordism and these assumptions. All of the things I do in public relate to what I've been talking about. So if you're interested in it, go track down my other stuff.
Okay. I will put this on my YouTube channel so we can see it, and I'll try to link it in the notes as well. So I'll get an email.
And I think I think if you go to my blog and on the About page at the bottom of that, I have kind of a greatest hits list too. Okay. The videos of me speaking and my posts that have been the most popular. Like I did a 3-hour guest lecture at BYU in fall on Genesis and evolution. Mm-hmm. To an honors group of freshmen that I was invited to do. I've put the outline up there. And all of these things come with dozens of links.
Well, I know.
There is tons to read.
Dozens is an underestimate, I believe.
And this isn't a question of me getting revelation. I don't claim revelation for my views. This isn't a question of me being smart. This is a question of me having read the right books in the right fields and trying to mesh them. Mm-hmm. And I wish there were someone else really in doing this kind of thing with me. There are a couple other people who kind of touch on parts of it. Mm-hmm. If someone's out there, drop me a note and we can collaborate. But it feels kind of like I'm forging my way through a jungle on my own.
Do you have an email address you want to share with everybody?
I think benjaminthescribe@gmail.com is kind of my public one.
All right.
And I can't respond to everything because technically I have a job, which is working on my PhD, so I can actually get a job and teach stuff.
So the goal is to finish that up this next semester and then go on.
Yeah, I hope to finish my dissertation within about 2 years because I have a lot of pre-work done regardless of which topic I do.
So you just got one more semester of classwork? And then
my coursework is done.
Oh, coursework is done.
Yeah.
You're just working on this. I'm
just reading all my books, preparing for my 3 exams in May. American Religious History, Reformation History, History of Science. And then I hope to propose my dissertation in May. Otherwise, it'll have to be fall. But then crank out my dissertation in 2 years or so.
Okay.
And then go on the job market. I would like to be at BYU. I would like to be anywhere. Most academics would just be happy with a job. I fit into that category, but I'm a very pastoral academic in the sense that I find a lot of value in shaping LDS minds and contributing to the community that I belong to and believe in. And so I see a lot of value in that over being at, whatever state, writing niche things for other niche scholars in our particular niche. Mm-hmm. That has to be done, of course. That's what scholarship is. It's moving forward and chipping away at your own niche. But I get a lot more personal satisfaction out of the people who drop me an email and say, I have always struggled with this, and I came across your podcast, and this is awesome, and it's so wonderful, and I'm glad I found it. That doesn't pay the bills like the niche stuff would at Podunk State or whatever, but, I do hope to be a professor.
Well, great.
Teaching history, teaching Bible, teaching languages. Yeah.
Well, cool. Well, Ben Spackman, I really appreciate you spending so much time here, and thanks for being on Gospel Tangents.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
Mm-hmm. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Ben Spackman. Ben, I'd like to thank you for spending so much time talking with us, and I learned a lot about evolution and especially the history in the LDS Church, and I really appreciate that. Thanks again, Ben. In our next conversation, we'll come with our first 2-time guest, Matt Harris. This is actually a continuation from our previous interview, but we're going to be talking more about President Benson, and Matt Harris has a new book out on President Benson.
The second book is, I've edited a collection of essays on Elder Benson, and it's about his rise in politics in the Eisenhower administration, also as a significant conservative leader after World War II. Most people don't realize that he was a presidential candidate and that he was very, very close with Barry Goldwater and some other leading conservative intellectuals, or leaders, I should say, politicians after World War II. And then, of course, Benson as a churchman. And as we can, I'm sure, talk about in a minute, Benson didn't make a whole lot of distinction between his politics and his religion.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Ben Spackman. We'll have a transcript out shortly on this conversation, and you can purchase individual copies at our website at gospeltangents.com/shop. If you want to be the first to get a copy, please subscribe on our website for just $10 a month. I'll send it to you first as a PDF. Or if you'd like a physical copy, for $15 a month, I'll be happy to send that to you as well. You can get our transcripts at our Amazon.com author page. I've got a link here, but just do a search for Gospel Tangents interview and you should be able to find a bunch of them there. Please subscribe at patreon.com/gospeltangents. For $5 a month, you can hear the entire interview uncut. And for $10, you can get a PDF copy. We've also got a $15 tier where if you want a physical copy, I'll be the first to send it to you. So please subscribe at Patreon or on our website at gospeltangents.com as well. For our latest updates, please like our page at facebook.com/gospeltangents. And also check our Twitter updates at Gospel Tangents as well. Please subscribe on our Apple Podcasts page at tinyurl.com/gospeltangents, or you can subscribe on your Android device. Just do a search for Gospel Tangents. Thanks again for listening. Click here to subscribe, here for a transcript, and over here we've got some more of our great videos. Thanks again.